Thank you very much, Amit, for those kind words, and thank you and Anirban for inviting me over. I'm so sort of reassured seeing such a large audience on a Sunday morning and people coming from all over India. It's exactly 30 years since I entered the media world. And at that time, the atmosphere was so oppressive that it's very, very difficult sometimes to recount the extent to which isolation was a real fact. I remember the tale of a reporter who's now quite an established person in his own right. And he was sent off to cover Advaniji's Rath Yatra in 1989. And he wrote from his field reports, and this was in the Times of India, that huge crowds, the likes of which we have not seen in recent times, was greeting the Yatra. And in fact, his reports went a long way in actually informing people in a pre-television age as to what exactly was the response to this. Very curiously, when he finished covering his leg of the Yatra, I mean the Yatra was a very large one, so various other reporters also said, he was summoned by some of his colleagues and says, you have to come to the press club, we are having a meeting to basically a trial to say, how dare you write these things. So there was a sort of a star chamber which had been set up by the press itself to say, this is allowed and this is not allowed. I remember 10 very distinguished, eminent historians, as Arun Shoury's very evocative phrase, who wrote a letter to the Times of India after one of my articles had come out and says, such articles may have a place in the organizer, but certainly don't have any role in the Times of India. That was their upholding of free speech. It was not a rebuttal to what I had said, which is fair enough. You can do that. So in other words, what we had for a very, very long time was that there was a narrative and there was nothing else. The idea that there could be more than one narrative was something which was consciously and totally rejected. So from that environment, so when I hear people talk about right-wing trolls, I sometimes recall those days of a one-sided monopoly and at least talk about that when there is resistance, there is now abuse. The basic point which was harped on by these people was that there is bound to be one narrative, because the type of narrative you are preferring has no intellectual basis. There is no intellectual pedigree to the type of narrative you want to see. Where is the Indian right? Where are the right intellectuals? The question my very dear friend and college mate Ramchandra Guha has often asked and said, there's none. There is P&O of slightly dodgy historical pedigree, and there's no one else. They have no one to offer. And that has been their thing. So when Ram Guha today, and it got me thinking, in the Hindustan Times, wrote a very interesting for a different reason, article on the Goraksha movement which is going on and which has captured the headlines in various forms. And he said that the origin of the Goraksha movement can be traced back to a letter written by Guruji Golwalkar in sometime in 1953. Not a letter, an article which he had written in 1953. And it was from there that the Goraksha movement really took off. It's a fascinating reinterpretation of history because it ignores the entire history from the 1900s, right from the 1900s. It ignores the very deep involvement of the Congress Party and the national movement with that with the Goraksha movement. And it scrupulously overlooks the fact that most of the anti-cow slaughter legislation which began with an insertion in the constitution was the creation of the Congress Party itself. In other words, what used to be common sense at one point in our lives suddenly became a fringe concern by 2016. So if you read what historians were writing about in the 1950s, right up to the late 1960s, you will find a particular narrative which you will not disagree with, but which can be updated, of course, with contemporary research, etc. But which has been completely buried and as if it doesn't exist. In 1997, when the 50th year of Indian independence came about, I was then working for India Today and we decided to publish a thing about the 50 great, or was it 100 great people who shaped India. And we had a certain section for historians. And I was very insistent that the name of Jadunath Sarkar be added into that for his contribution. And he was not the only one. Bhandarkar's name could have been added in, someone else's name could have been added in. And somehow the list, because they wanted to be extra cautious that we got the list right, one of the lists was given over to an eminent historian in JNU. He said, Jadunath Sarkar. I mean, the man was a charlatan. I mean, here you're talking about the man who pioneered the study of Maratha history, the man who pioneered the study of Mughal history, the man who insisted that if you wanted to do research, you had to go and learn those languages first so as to learn to understand those documents. So a certain rigor, empirical rigor of actually looking at documents, looking at things and therefore coming to a conclusion was replaced by what is called theory. It's the easiest way to do it. You theorize. And theoretical assumptions can often bear nothing to do with the ground realities. And that is at the heart of this. Hindole asked the question, why is there no Hindu studies? That's a very, very interesting point to actually take into account. There was a very flourishing discipline called Indology. Now you may not like the word Indology, some people have objections. I have no problem with if you want an alternative name, which included a rigorous study of Sanskrit texts, which included the study of Pali, which included the study of Prakrit, which included what all over the world they call the classics. How did that disappear overnight after independence? Some people talk about Macaulay's contribution in destroying Indian culture. Let me tell you that till 1947, Indology was a thriving discipline. After 1947, Indology became defunct. It is kept alive only because certain people in the West have still, some universities in the West have taken it. And naturally, if they have the monopoly of that, they will use it to their advantage. But at least I will compliment them for at least keeping it alive. Some of it is our own fault. We have problem with pedagogic approaches in trying to make Sanskrit a living language by broadcasting it on All India Radio or Doordarshan or something like that. We've forgotten that Sanskrit is actually a classical language. As a result, classical Sanskrit is dead, and a contrived Sanskrit which is taught in class 11, 12 or something, which people forget immediately, is kept alive. So the value of certain of our inheritance is lost. The other issue which is often talked about in this question of narratives and all that is that where do you come from? What is your intellectual ancestry? You are still preoccupied with the Vedas. You are using the parables of Mahabharata or Ramayana to use this. Is there any political theory backing you? Have you grown in complete isolation that you just from there to now, there is nothing to... This is one of the greatest myths which has been propagated. And the reason for it is very simply this. That is because the way in which political science and history has been taught in our universities today. Because not only is it selective when it comes to teaching of what is our inheritance, it is also equally selective when it comes to teaching what is the Western inheritance. So it's not really an assault on only India. It is an assault on knowledge, on the entire knowledge systems which have grown up. Now, last year, perhaps in response to these debates, King's College in London invited me to deliver a set of 3 lectures called Indian Conservatism. Now that gave me a good opportunity of actually going back to the texts, of actually exploring what is the basis of Indian political theory. And I came to this conclusion that there were certain fundamental features. Now I'm going to recount a few of those features in very, very brief detail. And then ask you to look at it in terms of Indian political thought. The basic idea is that nationhood is not bound by theory. It is not bound by theory for the very simple reason that human beings cannot be taken into a laboratory. That the human experience, that how individuals react, differ very much owing to different circumstances. And that goes against the very tenet of social sciences which says this is how it's bound to be. The second issue which is very important is that all over the West, it was believed at one time that the community wisdom necessarily always must prevail over individual wisdom. Because the community wisdom takes into account the accumulated experiences of centuries. Okay, there might be a time when an individual makes that breakthrough. But more than ever before, it is the community which comes in. Now if you look at the entire literature which was produced between the 18th to the early 20th centuries in India, you will find all these ideas replicated in one way or the other, but particularly in Marathi and Bengali. The idea that culture and religion cannot be separated is a fundamental feature of the writings of, say, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who wrote the book, Vande Mataram. It is absolutely at the heart of it. Now, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, for instance, believed that a revived form of Krishna worship was probably more. Others didn't agree with that particular point. But it was quite clear at every point that the Indian intellectual traditions, which may have taken their inspiration at one time from the classical texts, also had a very robust modern foundation. The question which we have to ask ourselves is, why has this been omitted? Part of the reason, I believe, is our own fault. For a very long time, Indian scholars, particularly nationalist scholars, operated in an isolated existence. They posited a binary world in which there was the West and there was themselves. And never the twain could meet. To my mind, this was one of the biggest. It was understandable why this happened. It was understandable because it was a reaction to the colonial experience. But 50, 70 years after we have become independent, we are looking at the West not from a position of domination, subordination. We are looking at the West as a part of the entire knowledge system of the world, which exists in science, but it doesn't exist in the social science. It is this defensiveness which has enabled a very distorted vision of what constitutes Western inheritance to be actually taught in the schools, to be taught through JNU, to be taught in other things, which is what propagates itself and multiplies itself more and more through the pages of the popular newspapers. The amount of distortion and ignorance of history which we see in the newspapers today is just colossal. And the reason why it's not been challenged is one more thing. Today there exists, for example, adequate archaeological evidence to prove that there existed a civilization which, if you want, you can call Indus Valley, if you want, you can call something else, you can call Saraswati civilization. But there is a civilization which exists. Archaeological evidence of it traces it right from the borders of Delhi, from Haryana, right up to nearly parts of Iran. It's gone out. It's a shame that the Archaeological Survey has never bothered about it. It's a shame that the Archaeological Survey still devotes itself only to the basic elementary protection of monuments, particularly Mughal elements, and does not extend the frontiers of knowledge. These are our own faults. But the result is that a certain view of what constitutes history has been entrenched and put in. Amartya Sen, in his book, The Argumentative Indian, has a very interesting point, very revealing in my way, more than interesting. He says the contribution of Akbar was that he was the first emperor who recognized minority rights. That's a very interesting point. Minority when it comes to dealing with the rights of 80% of the people. That is the minority rights. fallacies, conceptual fallacies like this are allowed to persist uninterrupted because of various reasons. The important thing now is for people who've taken this to lie back. Why? Because the platforms have been systematically denied to explain alternative points of view. When they get the platform, they are rubbished. Right-wing troll. You contest an idea, you're called a troll. I'm not necessarily arguing that people shouldn't be vile in their language and articulation, etc., etc. But take into account the irony of a certain thing. My dear friend Bharatiya today writes open letters. A person who has a television program with her, reduced to writing open letters means what? Means nobody's watching your program. And why are they not watching your program? Because if you contest every something, there is a British philosopher called Sir Roger Scruton who coined this wonderful term which I often use. It's called common decencies. Now it's very difficult to define what is a common decency. We understand it implicitly. There may be occasionally a little different. But when there are common decencies are violated and you start glorifying and idolizing a terrorist just because he was on Facebook, that is where the common decencies start getting violated. And that is when people use the power of the remote and switch on. So it is not a massive some sort of a fascist movement to get out. Now they come to the idea, this question of what you all are doing is against the idea of India. Now I thought that India is too vast a place, too diverse a place to be reduced to one single idea. There are ideas of India. So what do they mean when they say it is the idea of India? And it's very important to actually take into account what is their understanding of this idea. And this actually is borrowed from a German experience which also was used simultaneously with the idea of India. It is called constitutional patriotism, which means that all the values and ideals which a nation should have is embodied only in the Constitution. Now the Constitution is a very, very important document for us, because the Constitution sets out the ground rules of how politics and statecraft operates. But the Constitution does not define who we are, because that predates the Constitution. That predates the Constitution because it does not take into account the various other facets of culture, inheritance, which define us. So, when people say you are violating the idea of India, what they are saying is you are constantly enlarging your sense of Indianness into meaning something bigger. For us, India did not start in 1947. India did not start in 1947. India did not start in 1952. If you accept India started in 1950 or 47, you have a certain type of Indian you are going to build up. An Indian who will be very comfortable in South Asia, as we were heard in the last preceding session. An India who will look upon itself, who will use the word Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam to mean the Indianness has gone out. So a sense of universalism will come there. And that universalism will necessarily sap their idea of what is your distinctiveness. It's very, very important in today's age, as we move on, as we progress economically, as we regain a lot of international self-confidence. See, one of the biggest problems India faced was a lack of self-confidence. Indians faced. And I would urge you sometimes, I often see people quoting third-rate authorities from the West in order to supplement their argument. It is not necessary. It is not necessary, believe you, be discerning. There are authorities in the West who should be respected. But there are other authorities who, at the United States, is full of second and third rate universities. So just because the University of Minnesota, and I have nothing against Minnesota, some research associate there has published something, that's not the gospel. I am surprised in Parliament I hear people quoting somebody. Who is that person? I mean, what is the basis of their authority? And every research paper does not necessarily have the endorsement of an entire university. So be discerning. This is where some of us also have this problem. We end up accepting any certificate which is issued. It is not necessary to always look for certificates. It is more important to develop your own knowledge system. Find out where the gaps were, and there have been gaps. Al-Baluni in the 11th century said the Hindus have no sense of history. No, he was right and he was wrong in two different ways. He was right because the Hindu sense of chronology is almost zero. We have normally treated time in terms of yuga, which is too expansive a time. So often when you go and ask someone, aapko janm ka hua in a village, at least 40, 50 years ago, you could ask this. Oh, jis saal wo peड़ गिर गया था. So it's a very negotiable sense of time. So the precision which came in with the modern calendar has often been lacking. Now that, I think, is something we have to address in today's world. We have to be a little more precise. We have to also understand that you must judge history and you must read documents in terms of their own context. Something written in the 16th century had a 16th century context. It's very important to remember that. So while there may be universal wisdom in it, there is also contextual wisdom in it. So separate the universal from the contextual. Do not accept everything in total. And finally, there is this point. The term Hindu, as we all recognize, is a bit of a misnomer. We use it because it's in common usage. And if you say Sanatan Dharma, you will say, well, it's not in common usage, so people don't understand it. So, okay, Hindu is there. But there is no such thing as a Hinduism. There is different paramparas, different belief systems, which which govern the whole of the country. That's why when you say idea of India, ideas, I always took the plural is very, very important in our own civilization. Whether it's beginning with food, to belief systems, to rituals, although there might be commonalities. And if you go through Diana X's book on the sacred geography, there is an implicit Indian idea of common sacredness, which comes into our nationhood. The entire notion of Bharat Mata, which in the modern times was conceptualized by people like Bankim Chandra, but not him alone. And why did it become popular? Because it corresponded to a pre-existing belief system of this sacredness. That India is somehow sacred to us. But within that sacredness, there is a lot of diversity. And it's very important, therefore, when I get a little irritated when it says, and particularly this is true in North America and for the non-resident Indians, who have tried to codify Hinduism because they live in a different atmosphere. So therefore, while expressing a degree of solidarity with what the Hindus in North America do or not, be a bit cautious about it. They have their own idiosyncratic battles to fight. We do not have those battles to fight. We do not need to codify. They need to codify. If you go to an average North American Hindu temple, you'll find all the deities under one roof. Shiv, Krishna, sab kuch. Which is, maybe some of that is happening in some of our urban areas now. But by and large, each temple had its own distinctive identity, own distinctive cultural norms, etc., which were not necessarily in conflict with each other. And that is what made the richness. So the idea of codifying and saying, if you come into this battle of saying Hinduism decrees, then you've lost that battle. You've lost that battle totally. It's this multiplicity which is the basis of why democracy at the end of the day is very much an Indian concept. Because our cultural norms are given to pluralism, to democracy. That's why, to conclude, I would say that we are now at a very curious stage of our history, where for the first time, and I know this might sound a bit of an exaggeration, but after the election results of 2014, one person came and patted me on the back and said, Jai Ho! 1000 साल के बाद आज हिंदुओं ने फिर राजत्व कर I agree. It's hyperbole. It is a bit 140 words type of statement. But there is an element of truth also. That you feel the sense of self-reassurance. And that's why it's very important to rediscover. I use the word rediscover with consciousness. Because a lot of our inheritance was lost. They were not lost forever, they still exist. And it's therefore, in different ways, if we as writers can actually gently inform readers, we can nudge readers into thinking a little differently, into saying that look, what you've been told is not the absolute truth, that there are alternative ways of looking at history, that there are sometimes Indian cultural sensitivities which come into play in politics. We would have done. So it's in that thing, today we are lucky. The social media has opened up. There are a lot of things wrong with social media, I can see. But more than anything else, it has challenged the monopoly dominance of certain arrogant intellectuals. By breaking that monopoly, you have got a space. A space is now available. Utilize that space, because there are people who are hungry, who are dissatisfied with what they've heard before. That expresses itself in politics, that expresses itself in individual thinking. Of course, some of that dissatisfaction takes rather ugly forms and goes here and a bit berserk. But overall, this sense of restlessness creates the opportunities. I don't believe that there will be one single voice which will come out. There will be multiple voices which will express this dissatisfaction. Therefore, use it to construct an alternative narrative. But along with the alternative narrative, there has to be something else. There has to emerge and counter-establishment. This is a very important, this is a point I've always made. Because they are the people, the establishment sets the norms. Establishment again is a term very difficult to define. They set the norms. And today, as we saw during the entire award purpose year, the establishment is firmly hostile to the idea of change and rediscovery and reorientation of Indianness. So unless you can build a counter-establishment, unless you can expose and entrust enough people, sometimes they will go wrong. Yes, I agree. There will be a little tentativeness because they have not had the experience and the exposure. But unless you can do that, your attempt to rebuild India intellectually will never be fully successful. Today we are taking an intellectual battle, but the intellectual battle also depends on various other things. Take the issue of Nalanda University. I mean, just as a what was the purpose of creating Nalanda University to set up an alternative, another JNU? I mean, what was the purpose? Here was a place, here was an idea which was talking about the revitalization of Indology in the best sense, with a specific emphasis on Buddhist studies. Instead, all you do, you create an entire environment where another JNU is to be set up in Rajgir, which doesn't have the infrastructure, which doesn't have the intellectual ecosystem, etc. As a result, as usual, Government of India company ki maal pani mein dal. So these are the blunders which we have to guard against. We have to take a proactive measures to, for example, detach religious studies from the idea of philosophy. Today, do you know that India is the only major country where there is no there are no departments of religion? There is, and Hindol rightly pointed out, there are Islamic studies, but they are couched. Islamic studies, Buddhist studies. There are not a department of the study of Islam or department of study of Buddhism or Sanskrit study. Whenever that is necessary, it's couched in under philosophy. So you study Charvak along with Wittgenstein, even though they may have no connection to each other. So these artificial barriers which the idea of secularism has put up have to be dismantled. And for that, you have to mount, this is an intellectual project which has to be taken seriously. And then for all those who have any say in these matters, etc., I appeal to them, please evolve these ideas, develop them rigorously, propagate them, so that the larger question of developing alternative narratives is taken one step higher. We are just at the beginning of a long, long battle. We've taken one or two steps. there are many more steps to take because the challenge is quite formidable. But if you can win this battle, you can win this. This is really the battle for the recovery.